The transformation had been nothing short of miraculous, though Jake had learned that miracles were usually the result of careful planning, enormous effort, and the kind of vision that refused to be diminished by short-term obstacles or narrow-minded critics. The underground vault that had once been Tommy's secret sanctuary now served as the centerpiece of a climate-controlled exhibition space that showcased the evolution of American automotive excellence from the muscle car era through modern electric vehicle innovations. But beyond the obvious spectacle of rare and valuable automobiles, the Heritage Center had become something far more significant. A living laboratory where automotive history informed contemporary engineering challenges and where the dreams of past generations inspired future innovations. Jake's office occupied the top floor of the museum's administrative building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided panoramic views of the industrial district that had once seemed like a graveyard of abandoned dreams. The neighborhood had undergone its own transformation, with the Heritage Center serving as an anchor for economic development that had attracted automotive research facilities, specialty manufacturing companies, and educational institutions focused on advanced transportation technologies. What had once been a collection of forgotten warehouses and struggling repair shops was now a thriving hub of automotive innovation that generated thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in economic activity. The success had brought its own complications and responsibilities that Jake had never anticipated during those desperate months when foreclosure notices and Marcus Delano's mockery had seemed like insurmountable obstacles. Managing an institution of this magnitude required skills in finance, public relations, educational programming, and international diplomacy that Jake had developed through necessity rather than formal training. But Tommy's meticulous record-keeping and extensive network of professional relationships had provided a foundation that made the learning curve manageable, and Jake had discovered talents and interests he never knew he possessed. The Heritage Center's research division had become particularly significant in recent years, with automotive manufacturers and technology companies funding studies that used historical vehicles as inspiration for contemporary design challenges. The center's engineers had developed innovations in aerodynamics, material science, and powertrain efficiency by analyzing and reverse engineering solutions that Detroit's engineers had pioneered decades earlier. Academic partnerships with universities around the world had established the Heritage Center as a legitimate research institution whose contributions to automotive knowledge extended far beyond simple preservation and display. Jake's personal transformation had been equally profound, though more subtle than the obvious changes in his professional circumstances and financial situation. The confidence that had emerged during his confrontation with Marcus Delano had evolved into a quiet authority that came from understanding his place in a larger historical narrative and his responsibility as a steward of cultural artifacts that transcended individual ownership. He spoke regularly at automotive conferences and university symposiums, sharing insights about preservation techniques, historical research methods, and the intersection of technological innovation with cultural heritage that had become his area of acknowledged expertise. The Heritage Center's educational programs had perhaps exceeded even Tommy's most optimistic dreams for the impact his collection might eventually achieve. The museum's partnership with local school districts brought thousands of students annually to experience automotive history firsthand, inspiring many to pursue careers in engineering, design, or manufacturing that would have been unimaginable without exposure to the tangible evidence of human creativity and technical achievement that the collection represented. Scholarship programs funded through the Heritage Center's endowment were supporting the education of students whose backgrounds mirrored Jake's own challenging circumstances, providing opportunities that might otherwise have been denied due to economic limitations or social obstacles. The most satisfying aspect of the transformation was the recognition that had come from the automotive community that once dismissed or marginalized Jake's aspirations. Industry publications regularly featured articles about the Heritage Center's research contributions and educational innovations, often highlighting Jake's evolution from struggling mechanic to internationally recognized expert in automotive preservation and historical analysis. Invitations to serve on advisory boards and consulting committees had made him a genuine influence in discussions about the future direction of automotive technology and the importance of preserving engineering heritage for future generations. Marcus Delano's attempts to claim credit for or undermine the Heritage Center's success had become increasingly pathetic over the years, culminating in a failed lawsuit alleging intellectual property theft that had been dismissed with prejudice and sanctions for frivolous litigation. Premium Auto Works had struggled with financial difficulties as the automotive industry evolved toward electric vehicles and advanced manufacturing techniques that required expertise Marcus's organization had never developed. The last Jake had heard, Marcus was working as a regional sales representative for an automotive parts distributor, a position that provided steady income but little opportunity for the kind of influence and recognition he had once wielded through manipulation and intimidation. Eddie Castellanos had become the Heritage Center's Director of Facilities and Construction, overseeing ongoing expansion projects and maintaining the complex infrastructure required to support a world-class museum and research facility. His company, Castellanos Construction, had grown into a regional powerhouse, specializing in historic preservation and custom museum installations, with projects extending across the United States and internationally. The 25% share of net proceeds that had seemed like such a risky gamble during their initial partnership had provided Eddie with financial security beyond anything he had imagined possible in the demolition business. The Heritage Center's annual gala had become one of the automotive world's premier social and networking events, attracting collectors, manufacturers, celebrities, and enthusiasts whose combined wealth and influence represented billions of dollars in automotive-related investments. This year's event would be particularly significant, marking the 5th anniversary of the center's opening and the introduction of several major new initiatives that would expand its research and educational capabilities even further. Jake stood at his office window, watching as the catering staff prepared the museum's main exhibition hall for that evening's celebration, their movements carefully choreographed around the priceless vehicles that served as both historical artifacts and stunning backdrops for social interaction. The scene below represented everything Tommy had envisioned when he began building his secret collection decades earlier, a place where automotive excellence would be celebrated, preserved, and shared with people who could appreciate its significance and be inspired to create their own contributions to the ongoing story of human innovation. The guest list for the evening's gala read like a who's who of the automotive world, with confirmed attendance from executives representing every major manufacturer, celebrities whose private collections rivaled museums, and automotive journalists whose coverage would reach millions of enthusiasts worldwide. But perhaps more meaningful to Jake were the names of former colleagues from Premium Auto and other shops where he had worked during his struggling years, mechanics and technicians who had witnessed his lowest points and would now see the ultimate validation of the dreams and ambitions that had once seemed so unrealistic. Among the evening's honored guests would be Maria, Jake's sister, whose family had relocated to the area after her husband accepted a position with one of the automotive research companies that had been attracted by the Heritage Center's presence. Her children, now teenagers, had grown up visiting their uncle's museum and had developed passions for engineering and design that would have been unlikely without exposure to the tangible evidence of what was possible when creativity was supported by determination and resources. The family relationships that had been strained by Jake's obsessive pursuit of Tommy's secrets had been healed and strengthened by the success that validated his faith in his uncle's vision. The Heritage Center's library and archives had become a destination for researchers and historians from around the world, with Tommy's meticulously preserved records serving as the foundation for scholarly work that had contributed to multiple books, documentaries, and academic papers about American automotive history. The collection of prototype vehicles and concept cars that Miguel had discovered during their initial exploration of the underground vault had proven to be even more historically significant than anyone had initially realized, providing insights into design evolution and engineering approaches that had influenced the development of vehicles that millions of people drove every day. Jake's relationship with the broader Rivera family had also been transformed by the Heritage Center's success and the revelation of Tommy's extraordinary legacy. Relatives who had dismissed Tommy as an eccentric dreamer and Jake as an unrealistic follower of impossible aspirations now spoke with pride about their connection to the automotive preservation movement and the cultural institution that bore their family name. The financial aspects of the Heritage Center's operation had stabilized into sustainable patterns that ensured long-term viability without compromising the educational and research missions that drove its daily activities. Admission fees, corporate sponsorships, research contracts, and endowment income provided multiple revenue streams that reduced dependence on any single source of funding. The value of the original vehicle collection had continued to appreciate as the market for rare automobiles reached new heights. But more importantly, the vehicle's historical significance had been enhanced by their role in ongoing research and educational programming that increased their cultural value beyond simple monetary calculations. The center's international partnerships had become particularly rewarding, with exchange programs that brought automotive historians and preservation specialists from Europe, Asia, and Australia to study American muscle car development, while Heritage Center staff traveled abroad to learn from institutions with centuries of experience in cultural preservation. These relationships had elevated the center's academic credibility while providing Jake with perspectives on automotive history that transcended national boundaries and cultural assumptions about the significance of different engineering traditions. As the afternoon sun streamed through his office windows, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him from the ashes of professional humiliation to his current position as director of one of the world's most respected automotive institutions. The burned garage that had once seemed like the ultimate symbol of failed dreams had become the foundation for something that exceeded even Tommy's most optimistic visions for the impact his collection might eventually achieve. But perhaps more importantly, the experience had taught Jake about resilience, about the importance of believing in something larger than immediate circumstances, and about the power of properly supported dreams to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The phone on Jake's desk buzzed with a message from his assistant, reminding him that the evening's keynote speaker, automotive design legend Chip Foose, had arrived early and was requesting a private tour of the collection before the gala began. Jake smiled as he prepared to leave his office, remembering the days when meeting such a celebrity would have seemed impossible, when his reputation in the automotive community had been so damaged that even minor figures in the industry avoided association with him. Now, automotive legends sought him out for his expertise and insights, recognizing the Heritage Center as an institution worthy of their time and attention. As Jake walked through the museum's exhibition halls toward the main entrance where Chip Foose was waiting,
He passed displays that told the story not just of American automotive excellence, but also of the importance of preserving cultural heritage for future generations. School children who visited the Heritage Center would grow up understanding that the vehicles surrounding them represented more than transportation. They were expressions of human creativity, technological innovation, and the belief that tomorrow could be better than today if people were willing to work toward that vision. The Heritage Center had become Tommy Rivera's greatest masterpiece, but it was also Jake Rivera's vindication and the foundation for a future that honored the past while embracing the possibilities that lay ahead. The mocking laughter that had once echoed across a burned parking lot had been replaced by the excited voices of visitors discovering automotive treasures they had never imagined existed, preserved and presented by people who understood that some dreams are too important to be limited by conventional thinking or short-term obstacles. In the end, the story of the Rivera Automotive Heritage Center was really the story of faith. Tommy's faith in Jake's potential, Jake's faith in Tommy's vision, and their shared faith in the power of automotive excellence to inspire, educate, and transform the lives of people who encounter it with open minds and appreciative hearts. The concrete vault that had once hidden treasures from the world had become a beacon that attracted visitors from around the globe, drawn by the promise that some things are worth preserving, some dreams are worth pursuing, and some legacies are worth a lifetime of dedication to protect and share. As Jake opened the museum's main doors to greet his distinguished guest, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across exhibition halls filled with automotive treasures that would inspire future generations of engineers, designers, and dreamers. The burned garage had become a palace, the mocked mechanic had become a respected authority, and the hidden collection had become a gift to the world that would continue giving long after everyone involved in its discovery had joined Tommy Rivera in whatever place exists for people who understand that the best treasures are the ones you share with others who can appreciate their true significance.
The morning, Jake Rivera inherited a pile of ash and disappointment. The October wind carried the acrid smell of charred dreams across the industrial district like a funeral dirge. He stood at the chain-link gate of what had once been Gearhead's paradise, his Uncle Tommy's legendary garage, staring at the skeletal remains of twisted metal beams and blackened concrete that stretched before him like the aftermath of some automotive apocalypse. The insurance adjuster's clipboard fluttered in his hands, pages of denial and fine print that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the comfort they provided. "Well, would you look at what the cat dragged in?" came the familiar sneer from behind him. Jake didn't need to turn around to recognize the voice of Marcus Delano, his former supervisor from Premium Auto Works downtown. The sound of expensive Italian leather shoes crunched across broken glass and debris as Marcus approached with his usual swagger, no doubt savoring this moment like fine wine. "Jake Rivera, inheritor of the great Gearhead kingdom. How's that working out for you, hotshot?" Jake's jaw tightened as he slowly turned to face the man who had made his last 2 years at Premium Auto a living hell. Marcus stood there with his usual swagger, surveying the destruction with obvious satisfaction. Behind him lurked his two shadows, Brad and Connor, fellow mechanics who had sold their souls for Marcus's approval and the promise of advancement. They wore matching grins that reminded Jake of hyenas circling wounded prey. "Funny thing about dreams, Rivera," Marcus continued, pulling out his phone to snap a photo of the destruction. "Sometimes they literally go up in smoke. But hey, at least you got yourself a nice pile of concrete and some quality real estate in the armpit of the city." His laugh was sharp and cutting, designed to slice deep into Jake's already wounded pride. "I heard through the grapevine that dear old Uncle Tommy left you this masterpiece. What was his net worth again? Let me guess, negative 50,000 after the debts?" The words hit Jake like a physical blow, each syllable a reminder of every cruel joke, every sabotage project, every promotion that had mysteriously gone to someone else during his time at Premium Auto. Marcus had made it his personal mission to destroy Jake's reputation in the industry, spreading rumors about shoddy workmanship and unreliability. Now here he stood, perfectly groomed and smugly successful, while Jake held the keys to what looked like the world's most expensive disaster. "You know what I love most about this situation?" He gestured grandly at the burned ruins, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "It's poetry justice. You always thought you were better than the rest of us, didn't you? Walking around with that chip on your shoulder, acting like some kind of automotive messiah. Your uncle filled your head with all those stories about the glory days, about vintage muscle cars and legendary builds, and you bought into every word of it. But look around, Jake. This is reality. This is what happens when you chase fairy tales instead of focusing on actual business." Brad chuckled from his position near the gate, kicking at a piece of charred metal. "Remember that '67 Camaro project you were always bragging about, Rivera? The one you said was going to put you on the map? Wonder how many pieces that's in now." Connor joined in with his own observation, pointing at what might have once been a hydraulic lift. "Man, even the equipment looks like it went through a blender. Hope you got good insurance? Oh, wait, didn't Tommy always brag about being self-insured? How'd that work out for him?" Jake felt the familiar heat rising in his chest, the same anger that had gotten him into trouble at Premium Auto when he'd finally snapped at Marcus's constant harassment. But something held him back this time. Perhaps the weight of grief still heavy on his shoulders, or maybe just the sheer overwhelming nature of standing in the ruins of his uncle's life's work. Tommy Rivera had been more than just an uncle to Jake. He'd been a father figure, a mentor, and the only person who'd ever believed in his potential with engines and steel. The fire had happened 3 weeks after Tommy's sudden heart attack, as if the universe had decided to add insult to tragedy. The official report blamed faulty wiring in the office area, but Jake suspected it was more complicated than that. Tommy had always been paranoid about security, always muttering about people who might want to get their hands on his collection. Jake had assumed it was just the ramblings of an old man who'd spent too many years inhaling motor oil and exhaust fumes. Now, standing in the devastation, he wondered if there was been more truth to those fears than he'd realized. "Earth to Rivera!" Marcus snapped his fingers in front of Jake's face. "Don't tell me you're actually considering trying to rebuild this disaster. Please tell me you're not that stupid." His smile turned predatory as he leaned in closer. "Because if you are, I've got a business proposition for you. Premium Auto is always looking for good real estate in this area. We could take this liability off your hands for, say, 20 cents on the dollar. Think of it as charity, us helping out a former employee who's down on his luck." The offer was insulting on multiple levels, and Jake knew it was designed to be so. Marcus wasn't interested in charity. He was interested in humiliation. He wanted to see Jake broken and begging, forced to sell his uncle's legacy for pennies, while Marcus swooped in to claim whatever value might be hidden in the prime industrial location. The thought of Premium Auto's sterile corporate logo hanging where Tommy's hand-painted Gearhead's Paradise sign had once welcomed every grease monkey and gear enthusiast in the tri-state area made Jake's stomach turn. "Or, maybe," Connor chimed in with a cruel grin, "you could turn it into a parking lot. Might actually be worth something then." Brad nodded enthusiastically, adding his own contribution to the mockery. Yeah, or maybe a food truck lot. Tommy's Ash and Trash. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think? Their laughter echoed across the empty lot, bouncing off the surrounding buildings and seeming to multiply until it felt like the entire world was laughing at Jake's misfortune. He gripped the insurance papers tighter, the edges cutting into his palms as he fought to maintain some semblance of dignity in front of these vultures who had come to feast on his despair. But then something shifted in Jake's expression, a subtle change that Marcus might have noticed if he'd been paying closer attention instead of basking in his own cleverness. Jake's eyes moved past the obvious destruction to focus on details that didn't quite fit the narrative of complete loss. The concrete floor, for instance, looked remarkably intact despite the intensity of the fire that had consumed everything above it. There were stress patterns in the remaining metal framework that suggested the building's collapse had been more controlled than random. And there were subtle variations in the concrete surface, slight discolorations and what looked like very faint seam lines that could indicate something far more interesting than a simple slab foundation. Tommy had always been obsessed with the golden age of American muscle cars, the era when Detroit iron ruled the streets and horsepower was king. He'd told Jake countless stories about the legendary vehicles he'd worked on over the decades: rare Hemi Cuda convertibles, Shelby Cobras, Boss 429 Mustangs that were worth more than most people's houses. Jake had always assumed these were just the exaggerated tales of an old mechanic trying to impress his nephew, but now he found himself wondering if there had been more truth to those fears than he'd realized. "You know what, Marcus?" Jake said finally, his voice steady and controlled despite the chaos of emotion swirling beneath the surface. "I appreciate your generous offer, but I think I'm going to hold on to this place for a while. See what develops." He folded the insurance papers and tucked them into his jacket pocket, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both dismissal and determination. Besides, you never know what treasures might be hiding under all this ash and rubble.
Marcus's confident smile faltered slightly at Jake's unexpected composure. He'd been expecting either explosive anger or defeated acceptance, not this calm determination that suggested Jake knew something he didn't. "Treasures," he scoffed, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "The only treasure here is the copper wire you might be able to salvage from the electrical system, and even that's probably melted into slag." But Jake was no longer listening to Marcus's attempts to regain control of the conversation. His attention had been captured by something else entirely. A small section of the concrete floor where the debris had been cleared away by the fire department's investigation. There, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was a pattern that looked less like random concrete work and more like the outline of something deliberately concealed. The realization hit him with the force of a sledgehammer to the chest, and suddenly Tommy's paranoid mutterings about his special collection took on an entirely different meaning. The implications were staggering, and Jake felt his heart rate accelerate as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed began clicking into place. If he was right, if Tommy had been hiding something significant beneath the garage floor, then the fire might not have been the total disaster everyone assumed it was. In fact, it might have been the universe's way of revealing a secret that had been buried for decades, waiting for the right moment and the right person to uncover it. As Marcus continued his attempts to negotiate or intimidate, Jake found himself calculating the logistics of what it would take to properly excavate the concrete floor, the equipment he'd need, the permits required, and most importantly, how to do it all without attracting unwanted attention from people like Marcus, who would undoubtedly try to claim a piece of whatever was discovered.
The burned garage suddenly didn't look like the end of his dreams anymore. It looked like the beginning of something extraordinary, something that would not only restore his faith in Tommy's legacy, but potentially change his entire life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The question now wasn't whether he could afford to rebuild. It was whether he could afford not to dig deeper into the mystery that lay buried beneath his feet, waiting patiently for someone with the courage and vision to uncover it. This story is just getting started, and the discoveries ahead will blow your mind. Don't forget to hit that like button and share this with any car enthusiasts you know. They won't believe what Jake finds next.
Jake's financial situation grew more desperate by the day, a constant reminder that dreams don't pay rent or put food on the table. His savings account, never particularly robust to begin with, had dwindled to double digits after covering Tommy's funeral expenses and the first month of property taxes on the burned garage. The rejection letters from insurance companies had piled up like autumn leaves, each one containing increasingly creative ways to deny coverage for what they classified as pre-existing structural deficiencies and insufficient documentation of claimed assets. The bureaucratic language was designed to confuse and discourage, but Jake read every word with the desperation of a man searching for a life preserver in a storm-tossed sea. His job search had proven equally fruitless, a reality that weighed on him like a physical burden. Marcus Delano's influence in the local automotive industry ran deeper than Jake had initially realized, and it seemed that everywhere he applied, his reputation had somehow preceded him. Shops that had once welcomed him with open arms now offered polite excuses about being fully staffed or concerns about his reliability issues. The whisper network among mechanics was efficient and merciless, carrying Marcus's poison like a virus through the tight-knit community of gearheads and wrench-turners who had once considered Jake one of their own. "You're chasing ghosts, Jake," his sister Maria had said during their last phone conversation, her voice carrying that particular blend of concern and exasperation that only family members could perfect. She lived 3 states away with her husband and 2 kids, building a comfortable suburban life that seemed to exist in an entirely different universe from Jake's current struggles. Tommy was a sweet old man, but he was also a dreamer who spent more time talking about the past than dealing with the present. Maybe it's time to cut your losses and move somewhere fresh, somewhere Marcus's reputation can't follow you. Her words had stung precisely because they contained elements of truth that Jake wasn't ready to acknowledge. Tommy Rivera had indeed been a dreamer, a man who lived in the golden age of American automotive excellence, even as the world changed around him. His stories of legendary builds and celebrity customers had grown more elaborate with each telling, details shifting and morphing until it became impossible to separate fact from the wishful thinking of an aging mechanic who refused to accept that his glory days were behind him. But something deep in Jake's gut insisted that beneath the embellishments and exaggerations lay a foundation of truth that was worth investigating, no matter how slim the odds of success might be. The physical evidence at the garage site continued to fuel his growing obsession. During his daily visits to the property, Jake had begun mapping the concrete floor with the methodical precision of an archaeologist, using a borrowed metal detector and a notebook filled with increasingly detailed sketches. The patterns he'd initially dismissed as random stress fractures from the fire now revealed themselves as something far more deliberate when viewed from the right angles and in the proper light. There were subtle variations in the concrete composition, barely visible seam lines that suggested the floor had been poured in multiple phases, and most intriguingly, several areas where the metal detector registered significant readings that couldn't be explained by the surface debris.
The most promising area was a rectangular section approximately 30 feet by 60 feet near what had been the rear of the garage, positioned directly beneath where Tommy's office had once stood. The concrete here was slightly different in color and texture, suggesting it had been poured separately from the rest of the foundation, possibly years later. When Jake pressed his ear to the surface and struck it with a heavy wrench, the sound that echoed back was hollow and resonant, nothing like the solid thud he heard from other sections of the floor. The implications were tantalizing and terrifying in equal measure. If something significant was indeed buried beneath this section, the cost and complexity of excavation would far exceed his current resources.
His attempts to research Tommy's past had yielded fragments of information that painted a picture of a man who had lived multiple lives across several decades. Public records showed that Tommy had owned the garage for over 40 years, purchasing the property in 1983 with cash, in an era when such transactions were less scrutinized than they would be today. Before that, his trail became murkier, with employment records suggesting work at several high-end restoration shops in California during the 1970s, followed by a mysterious period in the early 1980s when he seemed to disappear from official documentation entirely. The most intriguing discovery had come from an old automotive magazine Jake found in Tommy's personal effects. A 1979 issue of Hot Rod Quarterly, featuring an article about legendary car collectors and their private museums. Buried in the back pages was a small photograph captioned "Private Collection Showcase," showing several vintage muscle cars arranged in what looked like an underground garage or showroom. The image was grainy and poorly lit, but Jake was almost certain he could make out Tommy's distinctive profile standing next to a pristine 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda convertible, one of the rarest and most valuable muscle cars ever produced. The financial pressure intensified with each passing day, a constant reminder that time was not on his side. His landlord had begun making pointed comments about late rent notices, and the utility companies were sending increasingly urgent letters about overdue payments. Jake found himself eating ramen noodles for dinner more nights than not, stretching his meager resources as far as they would go while pouring every available dollar into his investigation of the garage property. Friends from his premium auto days had stopped returning his calls, either out of loyalty to Marcus or simple discomfort with Jake's increasingly desperate circumstances. The isolation was perhaps the hardest to bear. Jake had always been something of a loner, preferring the company of engines and tools to the complexities of human relationships. But the complete social exile he now faced was more devastating than he had anticipated. The automotive community that had once embraced him as a rising talent now treated him like a pariah, crossing the street to avoid conversation or pretending not to see him when he entered parts stores and repair shops. The silence was deafening, a constant reminder of how quickly a reputation built over years could be destroyed by the right person with the wrong intentions. His investigation took on an increasingly desperate quality as his resources dwindled. Jake began visiting the property at odd hours, sometimes arriving before dawn or staying well past sunset, hoping to avoid the curious stares of neighboring business owners and the occasional patrol car that cruised through the industrial district. He'd taught himself to read concrete composition through online tutorials and library books, learning about aggregate types and curing patterns with the same intensity he'd once applied to understanding engine timing and compression ratios. The breakthrough came during a particularly frustrating afternoon when Jake was methodically testing the concrete with a rented core drilling bit, trying to determine the thickness of the slab without committing to full excavation. 3 feet down, the bit suddenly broke through into empty space, and Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized he'd found the proof he'd been seeking. The void beneath the concrete was substantial, extending far beyond the small pilot hole he'd created, and when he lowered a flashlight attached to a wire coat hanger into the opening, he could see enough to confirm that this was no natural cavity or simple building foundation. The space below was clearly man-made, with what appeared to be finished walls and a level floor extending into darkness beyond the reach of his improvised lighting system. The air carried scents of motor oil, leather, and vintage automotive interiors, with tire tracks visible in the dust. The discovery should have filled him with triumph, but instead it left him more conflicted than ever. The financial reality of his situation hadn't changed. If anything, it had become more precarious with each passing day. Even if the underground space contained something valuable, he lacked the resources to properly excavate and explore it. The equipment rental alone would cost thousands of dollars he didn't have, and there was no guarantee that whatever lay beneath the concrete would be worth the cost of retrieving it.
Worse still, the discovery came with its own set of complications and dangers. If word got out about a potential treasure vault beneath the garage, Jake would find himself dealing with complications ranging from legal challenges to outright theft. Marcus Delano was still circling like a vulture, making increasingly aggressive offers to purchase the property, and Jake suspected that his former supervisor had sources of information throughout the industrial district who might report any unusual activity at the garage site. The weight of the secret began to press down on Jake's shoulders like a physical burden, affecting his sleep and his ability to function in normal social situations. During a chance encounter with a former coworker at a parts store, Jake found himself stammering and nervous, terrified that somehow his discovery would be written across his face for anyone to read. The paranoia was probably irrational, but given everything he'd been through with Marcus's campaign of professional destruction, caution seemed like the better part of valor. His nights were filled with vivid dreams of underground treasure chambers filled with legendary muscle cars, their chrome bumpers gleaming under harsh industrial lighting, their engines purring with the promise of untold wealth and vindication. But the dreams invariably turned into nightmares where Marcus and his cronies appeared to claim everything, leaving Jake empty-handed and more humiliated than before. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and terror that had become his constant companion. The question that haunted Jake's every waking moment was whether he had the courage to pursue this lead to its logical conclusion, knowing that failure would mean not only the loss of his remaining resources, but potentially the final destruction of any hope for rebuilding his life and career. The safe choice would be to sell the property to Marcus, take whatever money was offered, and start over somewhere else with a clean slate and no expectations. But the safe choice felt like a betrayal of everything Tommy had represented, everything he tried to teach Jake about the importance of persistence and the value of believing in something greater than yourself. As October gave way to November and the first hints of winter began to creep into the air, Jake Rivera stood at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. Behind him lay the ashes of his former existence, the burned remnants of dreams that had once seemed so attainable. Ahead lay uncertainty, risk, and the tantalizing possibility that his uncle's greatest secret was still waiting to be discovered, buried beneath layers of concrete and decades of careful concealment. The choice was his to make, and whatever decision he reached would have consequences that rippled far beyond his current circumstances, shaping not only his own destiny, but the legacy of a man who believed in the power of hidden treasures and second chances.
The decision to excavate came not from careful planning or adequate funding, but from sheer desperation born of a foreclosure notice that arrived on a bitter December morning like a death sentence wrapped in legal letterhead. Jake Rivera stared at the document through bleary eyes, his coffee growing cold as he read the same devastating paragraph 3 times, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. 60 days. That's all he had before the county would seize the garage property for unpaid taxes, putting it up for public auction where Marcus Delano would undoubtedly be waiting with his checkbook and his predatory smile. The irony was almost poetic in its cruelty. He was about to lose the property just as he'd gathered enough evidence to prove that something extraordinary lay buried beneath its scarred surface. The small pilot hole he drilled had yielded tantalizing glimpses of the space below, but not enough information to attract investors or secure the kind of funding that proper excavation would require. Banks weren't interested in financing archaeological expeditions based on the hunches of unemployed mechanics, and Jake's credit score had taken such a beating over the past months that he couldn't qualify for a loan to buy a used lawnmower, let alone rent industrial excavation equipment. His salvation came from an unexpected source. Eddie Castellanos, a demolition contractor whose gambling debts had made him desperate enough to accept alternative forms of payment. Jake had known Eddie since high school, back when they'd both dreamed of careers that didn't involve crawling under other people's cars or breathing concrete dust for a living. Castellanos' demolition had fallen on hard times recently, victims of their own success in a market flooded with competitors willing to work for dangerously low margins. When Jake approached him with a proposal that was equal parts business deal and Hail Mary pass, Eddie listened with the interest of a man who had his back against the wall.
"Let me get this straight," Eddie said, leaning back in the cracked vinyl chair of his cluttered office trailer, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had seen better days. The trailer smelled of diesel fuel and old cigarettes, with motivational posters from the 1990s peeling off the particle board walls like aging skin. "You want me to break through a concrete floor that might be hiding some kind of treasure vault? And instead of paying me cash up front, you're offering me a percentage of whatever we find down there. And if we find nothing, I'm out the cost of equipment, labor, and materials." Jake nodded, knowing how insane the proposal sounded when spoken aloud. 25% of net proceeds after expenses, Eddie. And I'm not talking about some fantasy pirate treasure here. I'm talking about vintage automobiles that could be worth serious money. My uncle spent 40 years collecting cars, and I've got documentation suggesting he had access to some extremely rare vehicles. If even half of what I suspect is true, we could both walk away from this with enough money to solve our current problems, and then some. Eddie studied Jake's face with the calculating expression of a man who had made his living evaluating risk versus reward in situations where the margin for error was measured in injuries and lawsuits. He'd seen enough desperate people over the years to recognize the signs of a man with nothing left to lose. But there was something in Jake's eyes that suggested this wasn't just wishful thinking born of desperation. "You got any proof beyond your gut feeling and some old magazine pictures?" Jake spread his carefully organized evidence across Eddie's desk like a poker player, revealing a winning hand. Photographs of the pilot hole and the void space beneath, printouts of auction results showing 7-figure sales for rare muscle cars, documentation of Tommy's mysterious cash purchase of the property, and most convincingly, a soil analysis report that confirmed the presence of motor oil, rubber, and other automotive-related compounds in samples taken from the underground cavity. The scientific evidence was compelling enough to suggest that vehicles had indeed been stored in the space, though it couldn't confirm their current condition or value. "The way I see it," Jake continued, his voice gaining confidence as he laid out his reasoning. "You're looking at a calculated risk with potentially enormous upside. Your company is already stretched thin, and you've got equipment sitting idle that's costing you money every day. This project would put your crew back to work, give you a chance to recoup some recent losses, and, if my instincts are right, provide enough capital to expand your operations significantly." Eddie was silent for several long minutes, staring at the evidence while running mental calculations that Jake could almost see working behind his eyes. The demolition business was notoriously feast or famine, with contractors often forced to choose jobs that barely covered expenses and risky ventures that could either make their careers or destroy them completely. Eddie's recent string of low-margin municipal contracts had left him particularly vulnerable, and Jake's proposal offered the kind of potential windfall that could transform Castellanos Demolition into a regional powerhouse. "All right, Rivera," Eddie said, extending his calloused hand across the desk. 25% of net proceeds, with the understanding that if this turns out to be the world's most expensive wild goose chase, you owe me nothing but the satisfaction of saying I told you so. But I want full documentation of everything we find down there, and if this thing goes sideways with permits or legal challenges, you handle all the paperwork and bureaucratic nonsense." The handshake that sealed their agreement felt like the first positive development in Jake's life since Tommy's funeral, but the euphoria was short-lived as the reality of their timeline began to sink in. December in the industrial district was brutal, with temperatures regularly dropping below freezing and occasional snow squalls that could shut down construction projects for days at a time. The excavation would need to be completed quickly and quietly, before the property seizure deadline and before curious neighbors or city officials could complicate the process with questions about permits and environmental impact studies. Eddie's crew arrived at the garage site on a gray Monday morning that promised snow before nightfall, their equipment rumbling through the industrial district like an invasion force of steel and diesel power. The team consisted of Eddie himself, his nephew Miguel, who operated the smaller machinery with the precision of a surgeon, and two veteran demolition workers named Frank and Tommy, whose combined experience in concrete removal was measured in decades rather than years. They worked with the efficiency of men who understood that time was money and weather was their enemy, setting up a work area that balanced the need for speed with the requirement for precision that this unusual project demanded. The first major challenge came within hours of beginning the excavation, when the concrete proved to be significantly thicker and more heavily reinforced than any of them had anticipated. What Jake had assumed was a standard 4-inch slab turned out to be nearly 2 feet of industrial-grade concrete reinforced with a web of rebar that suggested whoever had poured it had been planning for much more than normal floor traffic. The discovery added hours to the project timeline and thousands of dollars to the equipment costs, as Eddie was forced to bring in a larger concrete saw and additional braking equipment to handle the unexpected density. "Your uncle wasn't taking any chances with this floor," Frank observed during a brief break, wiping concrete dust from his safety glasses as he studied the cross-section they'd exposed. The rebar was arranged in a pattern that suggested professional engineering input, with reinforcement density that would have been appropriate for a parking garage or loading dock rather than a simple automotive repair facility. "This is the kind of construction you see in bank vaults or government facilities, not neighborhood garages. Makes me wonder what he was trying to protect down there." The thickness of the concrete also meant that their initial estimate of the underground space dimensions was conservative. As more of the surface was removed, it became clear that the hidden chamber extended far beyond the rectangular area Jake had identified, possibly encompassing the entire footprint of the original garage building. The implications were staggering. If the space was as large as it appeared, it could potentially house dozens of vehicles, representing a collection value that could reach into the hundreds of millions of dollars if Jake's most optimistic theories proved correct. But with expanded scope came expanded risks,
both financial and legal. The noise and dust generated by the demolition work was beginning to attract attention from neighboring businesses, and Jake found himself fielding increasingly pointed questions from curious passers-by who wondered about the sudden intense activity at the burned-out garage site. His explanations about foundation repair and environmental remediation were technically truthful, but probably wouldn't hold up under serious scrutiny from city officials or insurance investigators. The breakthrough moment came on Wednesday afternoon, just as the crew was beginning to worry about their ability to complete the project before the weekend weather forecast promised a significant snowstorm. McGill's excavator had been systematically removing the broken concrete sections when the bucket suddenly punched through into empty space with a hollow thud that echoed up from the depths like a distant drumbeat. The sound was followed immediately by a rush of air that carried with it the unmistakable sense that Jake had detected through his small pilot hole, but amplified now to an almost overwhelming degree. Motor oil, leather, rubber, and something else that made his pulse quicken with recognition and anticipation. Eddie shut down all equipment immediately, understanding that they'd reached a critical moment that required careful assessment rather than continued demolition. The opening they'd created was approximately 6 feet square, large enough to accommodate a person, but small enough to maintain structural integrity of the remaining concrete slab. Jake approached the hole with the reverence of an explorer approaching an ancient tomb, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to reveal glimpses of what lay beyond the threshold they'd just crossed. The space below was vast, extending far beyond the reach of his flashlight beam, with a ceiling height that appeared to be at least 12 feet from floor to the underside of the concrete slab they'd just breached. The walls were finished concrete, painted white, and surprisingly clean despite decades of abandonment, with what appeared to be fluorescent lighting fixtures mounted at regular intervals. But it was the shapes and the shadows that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. The unmistakable silhouettes of automobiles, covered by protective tarps and arranged in neat rows like sleeping giants waiting to be awakened. "Jesus Christ," Eddie whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of cold wind whistling through the exposed opening. "Jake, I think your uncle might have been sitting on the automotive equivalent of King Tut's tomb." He played his own flashlight beam across the underground space, picking out details that confirmed their wildest hopes: chrome bumpers gleaming beneath protective covers, the distinctive curves of classic American muscle cars, and most remarkably, what appeared to be a sophisticated ventilation and climate control system that had kept the underground environment stable for decades. The discovery should have been cause for celebration, but Jake found himself overwhelmed with a mixture of emotions that ranged from vindication to terror. Everything he'd theorized about Tommy's secret collection appeared to be true, but the magnitude of what they'd uncovered brought with it complications he hadn't fully anticipated. The legal questions alone were mind-boggling. Who had rightful ownership of vehicles that had been hidden for decades, possibly without proper documentation? How would insurance companies and tax authorities react to the discovery of assets that may never have been properly declared? And most immediately pressing, how could they possibly secure and protect such a valuable find while completing the excavation and assessment process? The weather chose that moment to turn decisively worse, with the first flakes of the promised snowstorm beginning to fall, just as Jake was lowering himself through the opening for his first direct exploration of Tommy's hidden automotive sanctuary. The temperature had been dropping steadily throughout the afternoon, and the combination of cold air and nervous excitement made his hands shake as he gripped the ladder Eddie had positioned in the opening. The moment Jake's feet touched the underground floor, he felt as though he'd been transported to a different world entirely. The underground space revealed itself to be even larger than expected, with new sections extending beyond what Jake had initially explored. Jake's flashlight beam danced across shapes that made his automotive enthusiast's heart race with recognition and disbelief. There, beneath a fitted cover that had kept decades of dust at bay, was the unmistakable profile of a 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda convertible, one of perhaps 24 such vehicles ever produced, with current auction values approaching $2 million for pristine examples. Nearby sat what appeared to be a Shelby Cobra 427, its distinctive curves visible beneath its protective tarp, representing another seven-figure automotive investment if it proved to be authentic. But perhaps most remarkable was the sheer scope of the collection, which appeared to span multiple decades and represent the absolute pinnacle of automotive performance from the muscle car era. Jake counted at least 30 vehicles in his initial survey, each one positioned with the care of a museum curator, each one representing a piece of automotive history that most enthusiasts could only dream of experiencing firsthand. The financial implications were staggering, but beyond the monetary value was the cultural and historical significance of what Tommy had apparently preserved beneath the streets of an industrial district that most people drove through without a second thought. As Jake explored deeper into the underground space, his excitement was tempered by growing awareness of the challenges they would face in extracting and documenting this incredible find. The access opening they'd created was barely large enough for a person, let alone the vehicles they'd discovered. Getting the cars to the surface would require either expanding the opening significantly or locating whatever entrance Tommy had originally used to move the vehicles into the underground space. Given the size and weight of some of the vehicles they'd found, there had to be a more substantial access point somewhere, possibly connected to a ramp or elevator system that Jake hadn't yet located. The snowstorm that had been threatening all afternoon chose that moment to arrive in earnest, transforming the excavation site into a hazardous environment that forced Eddie to make the difficult decision to suspend operations until conditions improved. As Jake reluctantly climbed back to the surface, his mind was racing with implications and possibilities that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. They'd proven that Tommy's collection was real and potentially worth a fortune, but they'd also opened a Pandora's box of complications that would require careful navigation to resolve successfully. The storm that night was particularly brutal, dumping 8 inches of snow on the industrial district and creating conditions that made travel treacherous for anyone not equipped with four-wheel drive and winter tires. Jake spent the evening in his apartment, staring at the photographs he'd taken in the underground space and trying to process the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Each image revealed new details that suggested the collection was even more valuable than his initial assessment had indicated. Rare options packages, matching numbers engines, and most importantly, documentation folders visible in the background that might contain the provenance information necessary to establish legal ownership and authentic value. But even as Jake celebrated this vindication of his faith in Tommy's stories, he was painfully aware that their success had created new and potentially dangerous vulnerabilities. Word of their excavation activities was already beginning to spread through the tight-knit community of industrial district businesses, and it would only be a matter of time before someone connected the dots between the unusual demolition work and the potential for significant discoveries. Marcus Delano had been conspicuously absent from his usual harassment routine, which Jake found more worrying than comforting. Silence from his former supervisor usually meant he was planning something more elaborate than his typical direct confrontations. The security concerns were particularly pressing given the remote location of the garage site and the limited resources available for protecting such a valuable discovery.
Even with the underground space concealed beneath the concrete slab, the excavation had created obvious signs of significant activity that would be visible to anyone familiar with construction or demolition work. The equipment tracks, debris piles, and most tellingly, the carefully arranged security fencing that Eddie had installed around the work area all pointed to something far more significant than routine foundation repair or environmental cleanup. As the snow continued to fall outside his apartment window, Jake found himself caught between elation and anxiety in equal measure. They had achieved the impossible by proving that Tommy's collection existed and was potentially worth more than anyone had dared to imagine. But they'd also committed themselves to a course of action that would require resources, expertise, and legal support far beyond anything Jake had originally anticipated. The 60-day deadline for property seizure was still ticking away like a time bomb, and despite their incredible discovery, Jake was no closer to solving the immediate financial crisis that threatened to make all their efforts irrelevant. The phone call that would change everything came at 3 in the morning, jarring Jake from his restless sleep with the electronic persistence of a fire alarm. The voice on the other end was Eddie's, but strained with an urgency that immediately put Jake on high alert. "Eddie, you need to get down to the site right now. We've got a problem, a big one. Someone's been here, and they didn't come just to look around." Jake Rivera arrived at the garage site to find a scene that made his blood run cold in the pre-dawn darkness. The security fencing Eddie had carefully installed around the excavation area had been cut with precision tools, the chain-link panels folded back like the petals of some massive steel flower to create an entrance wide enough for vehicles. Fresh tire tracks in the snow led directly to the opening they'd created in the concrete floor, and the portable lighting system Eddie had positioned around the work area had been systematically destroyed, leaving only scattered fragments of plastic and metal to mark where thousands of dollars of equipment had once stood. Eddie stood near the excavation opening, his face grim in the harsh glare of emergency floodlights powered by a portable generator that coughed and wheezed in the frigid air. His nephew Miguel paced nearby, his usual calm demeanor replaced by the nervous energy of a man who understood they were dealing with something far more serious than simple vandalism or theft. The damage to the site was too systematic, too professional to be the work of opportunistic criminals or curious teenagers looking for trouble. "They knew exactly what they were looking for," Eddie said without preamble as Jake approached, his breath forming clouds in the bitter cold. "This wasn't random. Whoever did this had detailed knowledge of our operation, probably including blueprints or photographs of what we've uncovered down there." He gestured toward the opening, where Jake could see that someone had installed a much more sophisticated access system than their improvised ladder, a motorized winch and platform arrangement that would have required significant planning and equipment to transport and install. "Did they take anything?" Jake asked, though he already suspected the answer based on Eddie's expression and the obvious signs of major equipment installation at the site. The professional nature of the break-in suggested this wasn't about theft in the traditional sense, but rather about gaining access to and documenting what lay beneath the concrete floor they'd worked so hard to breach. Miguel answered with a mixture of anger and professional admiration that spoke to his years in the demolition business. "They didn't take anything, but they definitely cataloged everything. Look at this." He led Jake to the edge of the opening, where powerful LED floodlights now illuminated the underground space with the kind of intensity used for professional photography or video documentation. The entire vault was visible in stark detail, revealing the full scope of Tommy's collection in a way that Jake's handheld flashlight explorations had never achieved. The sight that greeted Jake as he peered into the illuminated underground space was simultaneously breathtaking and terrifying. The automotive collection was even more extensive than his initial survey had suggested, with vehicles arranged in carefully organized rows that extended far beyond the original garage footprint.
What he'd initially estimated as 30 cars proved to be closer to 60, each one representing a significant piece of American automotive history and collectively forming what might be the most valuable private collection of muscle cars ever assembled. But more disturbing than the scope of the collection was the evidence of systematic documentation that the intruders had clearly conducted during their unauthorized visit. Professional photographic equipment had been positioned throughout the space, with tripods and lighting rigs still in place around several of the most significant vehicles. Memory cards and storage devices were scattered across makeshift workstations, suggesting that whoever had orchestrated this break-in had spent considerable time cataloging and appraising the collection with the thoroughness of insurance adjusters or auction house experts. "There's more," Eddie said grimly, producing a manila envelope that had been left conspicuously on the hood of the nearest vehicle, a pristine 1969 Dodge Charger RT that gleamed like liquid mercury under the harsh artificial lighting. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope, whether from the cold or from anxiety, he couldn't determine. Inside were high-resolution photographs of every vehicle in the collection, each image professionally lit and shot from multiple angles to showcase identifying features, VIN numbers, and any unique characteristics that would be relevant for authentication and valuation purposes. The quality of the documentation was museum-grade, suggesting access to equipment and expertise that ruled out amateur treasure hunters or opportunistic criminals. But the photographs were just the beginning. Beneath them were detailed appraisal documents that made Jake's knees weak with a combination of vindication and terror. Each vehicle had been identified, researched, and valued with the precision of a major auction house, complete with provenance information, restoration details, and current market valuations that totaled well over $200 million. The numbers were so staggering that Jake had to read them multiple times before they fully registered, each decimal point representing more wealth than he'd ever imagined possible. The crown jewel of the collection, according to the documentation, was a 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda convertible in vitamin C orange, one of only 14 such vehicles ever produced, and the only known example with the rare 4-speed manual transmission and factory air conditioning options. The appraisal listed its current market value at $12 million, assuming authentication and provenance could be established. But even more remarkable were the supporting documents that suggested Tommy had acquired the vehicle directly from Chrysler as part of some kind of special arrangement that predated normal dealer networks. "Look at the bottom of the stack," Eddie urged, his voice tight with concern. "That's where things get really interesting, and not in a good way." The final document in the envelope was a formal purchase offer, printed on expensive letterhead that Jake recognized with a sinking heart. Premium Auto Works, Marcus Delano's company, was offering to acquire the entire collection for $50 million cash, with a closing date just 2 weeks away, well before Jake's property seizure deadline. The offer was structured as a private sale to avoid public auction complications, with provisions for immediate transfer of all vehicles to secure storage facilities pending final authentication and legal documentation. $50 million, Jake said aloud, the number feeling surreal in his mouth. For a collection they valued at over $200 million? The mathematics of the situation were brutally clear. Marcus was positioning himself to acquire Tommy's life work for approximately 25 cents on the dollar, using Jake's desperate financial situation and impending property seizure as leverage to force acceptance of terms that no rational seller would ever consider under normal circumstances. But perhaps more disturbing than the lowball offer was the implicit threat contained in the final paragraph of the document. The purchase offer made specific reference to irregularities in property documentation and potential tax liability issues that could complicate any attempt to market the collection through normal auction channels. The language was deliberately vague, But the implication was clear. Marcus had done his homework on Tommy's business practices and had identified potential legal vulnerabilities that could be exploited to pressure Jake into accepting the unfavorable terms.
Miguel had been exploring the underground space while Jake and Eddie reviewed the documentation, and his voice echoed up from the depths with a mixture of awe and concern. "You guys need to see this. There's a lot more down here than just cars." His tone suggested discoveries that went beyond even their expanded understanding of the collection's scope and value. Jake descended into the vault using the professional access system the intruders had installed, still trying to process the magnitude of what they'd uncovered and the complexity of the situation they now faced. The LED lighting revealed details that his previous flashlight exploration had missed, including a sophisticated organizational system that suggested Tommy had been running something far more complex than a simple private collection. The vehicles were arranged in chronological order by model year with detailed information cards attached to each one that included acquisition dates, restoration notes, and what appeared to be coded references to previous owners or sources. Some of the codes seemed to reference celebrities or public figures, while others suggested connections to automotive manufacturers, racing teams, or private collectors whose names Jake recognized from automotive magazines and auction house catalogs. But Miguel's discovery that demanded immediate attention was located in a separate section of the underground space that Jake had missed during his initial exploration. Behind a partition wall that blended seamlessly with the rest of the concrete construction was what could only be described as Tommy's private office and documentation center, a climate-controlled room filled with filing cabinets, photographic equipment, and what appeared to be decades of records related to his automotive acquisitions and business dealings. The files contained a treasure trove of information that painted a picture of Tommy Rivera as something far more sophisticated than the small-town mechanic he'd appeared to be on the surface. Purchase agreements, shipping manifests, and correspondence with automotive manufacturers revealed a network of connections that spanned the global collector car market, with business relationships that included everyone from NASCAR team owners to Hollywood celebrities to European royalty with expensive automotive habits. "Your uncle wasn't just collecting cars," Miguel observed as he leafed through files that documented transactions dating back to the 1970s. "He was running some kind of automotive preservation and investment operation. Look at these profit and loss statements. He was making millions of dollars a year buying, restoring, and reselling rare vehicles, all while maintaining this core collection as his personal repository of the most significant examples." The documentation revealed that Tommy had been extraordinarily careful about legal compliance and tax obligations, with meticulous records that would satisfy even the most aggressive audit by federal authorities. Every transaction was properly documented, every tax liability accurately calculated and paid, every international shipment properly declared and cleared through appropriate customs channels. The discovery effectively neutralized Marcus's implied threats about irregular documentation or tax problems, while simultaneously establishing clear legal ownership of the entire collection. But perhaps the most significant discovery was a sealed envelope marked "to be opened only upon my death" that had been prominently displayed on Tommy's desk, as though he'd been expecting exactly this moment. Inside was a letter written in Tommy's familiar handwriting, along with legal documents that transformed Jake's understanding of both the collection and his own inheritance in ways that left him speechless with shock and gratitude. The letter explained that Tommy had spent the last 40 years not just collecting automotive treasures, but specifically preserving them for Jake's eventual inheritance. Every acquisition had been made with the knowledge that someday his nephew would need the financial security and professional vindication that such a collection could provide. Tommy had anticipated the challenges Jake would face in the automotive industry, the professional jealousy and political maneuvering that could derail a career, and had methodically built this underground sanctuary as an insurance policy against such eventualities. I know by the time you read this, circumstances have probably forced you to dig deeper than anyone expected. I also know that people like Marcus Delano will be circling like vultures trying to claim what rightfully belongs to you. Don't let them intimidate you with threats or illegal maneuvering. Every vehicle in this collection is properly documented, legally acquired, and free from any encumbrances. The total current value should be sufficient to establish your own automotive business, pursue whatever projects interest you, and never again worry about the opinions of small-minded people who mistake politics for competence.
The legal documents included updated titles for every vehicle in the collection, all properly transferred to Jake's name, with documentation dating back to the original purchase agreements. There were also business incorporation papers for Rivera Automotive Reservation, a company that Tommy had established years earlier with Jake as the sole beneficiary and inheritor. The corporate structure provided significant tax advantages and legal protections, while also establishing Jake's credentials as a serious player in the collector car market rather than simply a lucky inheritor of valuable assets. But the final document in Tommy's envelope was perhaps the most emotionally powerful. A detailed letter of recommendation addressed to whom it may concern that documented Jake's automotive knowledge, technical skills, and character in terms that would carry significant weight with anyone familiar with Tommy's reputation in the industry. The letter specifically addressed the kinds of professional challenges that Jake had been facing, providing character references and technical endorsements that could effectively counteract years of Marcus Delano's attempts at reputation destruction. As Jake read Tommy's final words to him, written years earlier, but with prescient understanding of exactly the situation he would eventually face, tears clouded his vision despite the harsh lighting and bitter cold of the underground space. Tommy had known that Jake would struggle, had anticipated the professional jealousy and personal attacks that would threaten his career, and had spent decades building not just financial security, but also the tools necessary for professional vindication and personal redemption. The sound of vehicles approaching the excavation site broke through Jake's emotional reverie, bringing him back to the immediate reality of their situation. Eddie's voice echoed down from the surface with urgency that suggested their brief window of privacy was about to close, probably not in their favor. "Jake, we've got company. Multiple vehicles, and they don't look like they're here for a social visit." Jake climbed quickly back to the surface, Tommy's documents clutched tightly in his hands, to find that Marcus Delano had indeed arrived with what appeared to be a small army of support personnel. 3 black SUVs were parked outside the security fence, their engines running and exhaust visible in the cold air, while figures in expensive winter clothing emerged with the confident stride of people accustomed to getting their way through intimidation and superior resources. "Well, well," Marcus called out as he approached the group clustered around the excavation opening. "Jake Rivera, destroyer of reputations and discoverer of buried treasure. I have to admit, you've managed to surprise me with both the scope of your uncle's collection and your own talent for dramatic timing." His smile was sharp and predatory, suggesting that despite the early hour and harsh weather, he was thoroughly enjoying this confrontation. "I trust you've had a chance to review my purchase offer," Marcus continued, producing a copy of the same document Jake had found in the manila envelope. $50 million, cash, immediate closing, all legal complications handled by my team of specialists. It's a generous offer under the circumstances, especially considering the tax implications and authentication challenges you'll face if you try to market this collection through normal auction channels. Jake felt a surge of confidence that would have been impossible just hours earlier, before Tommy's letter had revealed the careful planning and legal preparation that anticipated exactly this moment. Actually, Marcus, I think there might be some misunderstandings about the circumstances you're referring to. The collection is properly documented, legally owned, and authenticated by experts whose qualifications exceed anything your team might offer. The surprise that flickered across Marcus's face was quickly replaced by his usual calculating expression, but Jake had caught the momentary crack in his confident facade. Marcus had been counting on legal ambiguity and documentation problems to force acceptance of his lowball offer, and Jake's unexpected composure suggested that his leverage might not be as strong as he had assumed.
"We'll see about that," Marcus replied, gesturing to his legal team. "In the meantime, I think you'll find that time is not on your side. Property seizure deadlines don't wait for authentication processes or legal research, and my offer expires at the end of business today. After that, you'll be dealing with public auction procedures that may not be as favorable to your financial situation." But Jake was no longer the desperate, isolated mechanic who had been mocked and marginalized for months. Tommy's legacy had provided not just financial security, but also the professional validation and personal confidence that Marcus had spent years trying to destroy. The $200 million collection in the vault beneath their feet represented more than just automotive treasures. It represented proof that dreams could be preserved, that persistence could be rewarded, and that sometimes the people who mock your ambitions are exactly the ones who understand their true value. As the confrontation escalated in the bitter December wind, with Marcus's team positioning themselves around the excavation site like an occupying army, Jake realized that the real battle was just beginning. The discovery of Tommy's collection had transformed him from a victim of circumstances into a major player in the collector car market. But it had also made him a target for people whose resources and ruthlessness far exceeded anything he'd previously encountered. The question now was whether he had the courage and strategic thinking necessary to protect Tommy's legacy while building his own future from the extraordinary foundation his uncle had so carefully constructed. The transformation in Jake Rivera's demeanor was so complete that even Eddie Castellanos, who had known him since high school, barely recognized the man who now stood facing Marcus Delano with quiet confidence instead of desperate anxiety. The documents clutched in Jake's hands represented more than just legal proof of ownership. They were tangible evidence of Tommy's faith in his nephew's eventual success, a faith that had been carefully nurtured and protected through decades of methodical planning. As Marcus's team positioned themselves around the excavation site with the calculated precision of a hostile takeover, Jake felt the weight of generations of automotive passion flowing through him like an electric current. "You know what I find most interesting about your offer, Marcus?" Jake said, his voice carrying across the frozen industrial landscape with a clarity that cut through the morning wind. "It's not just that you're trying to steal $200 million worth of automotive history for 25 cents on the dollar. It's that you apparently believe I'm still the same desperate mechanic you spent 2 years trying to destroy at Premium Auto." He gestured toward the underground vault, where the LED lighting continued to showcase Tommy's incredible collection in all its pristine glory.
But that mechanic doesn't exist anymore. He died the moment I realized that everything you told me about my limitations, about my place in this industry, about my uncle's worthless fantasies, all of it was just projection from a man who spent his entire career stealing other people's dreams because he never had the courage to pursue his own. Marcus's confident facade flickered like a candle in a strong wind, his practiced smile becoming strained as he processed Jake's unexpected composure and the implications of what lay beneath the concrete slab. His legal team exchanged glances that suggested they'd been briefed on a very different scenario, one that involved a desperate property owner willing to accept any reasonable offer rather than face foreclosure and public humiliation. The presence of professional documentation and Tommy's carefully preserved records had clearly not been their strategic calculations. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Rivera," Marcus replied, but his voice lacked its usual commanding tone. "You're still facing the same deadline, the same tax obligations, and the same practical challenges of authenticating and marketing a collection of this magnitude. My offer provides immediate liquidity and eliminates all the risks associated with trying to navigate the collector car market on your own." He gestured toward his team of specialists, who were now photographing the excavation site and the underground space with the methodical efficiency of insurance adjusters documenting a claim. But Jake had spent the previous hour reviewing Tommy's meticulous records, and he understood far better than Marcus realized exactly what those authentication and market challenges actually entailed. Every vehicle in the collection had been purchased through legitimate channels with full documentation, restored by acknowledged experts in their respective fields, and maintained to museum-quality standards that would satisfy even the most demanding auction house or private collector. More importantly, Tommy's business records included contacts and relationships throughout the global collector car community that would provide Jake with access to buyers and resources that Marcus could never match. "Actually, Marcus, I think you're the one who needs to be more realistic about the situation we're facing here," Jake said, producing a thick folder from Tommy's files that contained correspondence with Barrett Jackson, R.M. Sotheby's, and other major auction houses dating back over 2 decades. "My uncle wasn't just some small-town mechanic who got lucky with a few barn finds. He was a recognized expert in American muscle car authentication and restoration, with professional relationships that include everyone from Jay Leno to the Peterson Automotive Museum. This collection isn't going to have any trouble finding appropriate buyers at fair market value." The folder Jake displayed contained letters of authentication from factory engineers who had originally designed the vehicles in Tommy's collection, restoration documentation from shops that specialized in concourse-level work, and most impressively, correspondence from automotive journalists and historians who had featured various vehicles from the collection in magazine articles and academic papers over the years. The documentation was so comprehensive that it effectively constituted a 30-year peer review of Tommy's expertise and the authenticity of his acquisitions. Miguel, who had been continuing his exploration of the underground space during the confrontation above, chose that moment to emerge from the vault with discoveries that would shift the balance of power even more dramatically in Jake's favor. In his hands were additional documents that revealed the true scope of Tommy's automotive preservation efforts, including partnerships with automotive manufacturers for the storage and maintenance of prototype vehicles and concept cars that had never been released to the general public. "Jake, you need to see what else is down there," Miguel called out, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who had just realized they were standing in the automotive equivalent of the Smithsonian Institution's secret archives. "Your uncle wasn't just collecting production cars. He was preserving automotive history that most people assumed had been lost forever. There are vehicles down there that automotive historians thought were destroyed decades ago. The revelation that Tommy's collection included not just rare production vehicles, but also unique prototypes and concept cars elevated its significance far beyond simple monetary value. These were vehicles that represented crucial steps in automotive design evolution, irreplaceable examples of engineering approaches that had shaped the development of modern automobiles. Their historical importance would attract attention from automotive museums, universities, and research institutions worldwide, creating marketing opportunities that would far exceed anything possible through traditional collector car channels. Marcus's team of appraisers had been listening to this exchange with growing concern, and Jake could see them whispering among themselves as they realized that their initial valuation of $50 million might be off by an order of magnitude. The presence of prototype vehicles and manufacturer partnerships suggested provenance and authenticity that would command premium prices from institutional buyers who valued historical significance as much as investment potential. "Look, Rivera," Marcus said, his voice taking on a more conciliatory tone as he recognized that his position was becoming increasingly untenable. "The collector car market is complex, and there's plenty of room for collaboration between experienced professionals. Why don't we discuss a partnership arrangement that would benefit both of our organizations?" His attempt to pivot from hostile takeover to collaborative partnership was transparently desperate, but it revealed his growing awareness that the power dynamic had shifted decisively against him.
"You know what, Marcus?" Jake said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that comes from finally understanding your own worth and power. "I think I'm going to pass on any kind of partnership arrangement. Not because I'm vindictive or petty, though you certainly deserve both of those responses, but because I've finally realized something that should have been obvious years ago. I don't need your approval, your connections, or your resources to succeed in this industry. I never did." Jake turned to address Marcus's entire team, his voice gaining strength and clarity as he spoke. "My uncle spent 40 years building this collection, not just as an investment, but as a legacy for someone he believed could appreciate its true significance. He saw potential in me that I couldn't see in myself, and he built something extraordinary to ensure that potential would have the opportunity to flourish. I'm not going to let that vision be diminished by people who measure everything in terms of quick profits and market manipulation." The silence that followed Jake's declaration was broken only by the sound of wind whistling through the industrial district and the distant rumble of Eddie's generator powering the lights that illuminated Tommy's underground sanctuary. Marcus's team stood in obvious uncertainty, their carefully planned acquisition strategy having collapsed in the face of Jake's unexpected confidence and the overwhelming evidence of legitimate ownership and proper documentation. Eddie stepped forward to break the tension, his practical nature asserting itself as he recognized the need to move beyond confrontation toward actual resolution. "Seems like you folks might want to reconsider your approach to this situation," he said to Marcus's team. "Jake's got clear legal ownership, professional documentation, and plenty of time to explore his options for marketing this collection. Your deadline pressure doesn't seem to be carrying much weight under these circumstances." Marcus made one final attempt to salvage something from the confrontation, producing a revised offer sheet that doubled his initial bid to $100 million. "This is my final offer, Rivera, $100 million cash, immediate closing, no questions asked about provenance or tax implications. It's more money than you've ever imagined having, enough to set you up for life without the headaches of managing a collection this complex." Jake looked at the revised offer with the detached amusement of someone who had finally learned to recognize manipulation for what it was. $100 million was indeed more money than he'd ever imagined having, but it was still less than half the assessed value of Tommy's collection, And more importantly, it represented exactly the kind of thinking that had driven Marcus's career, the belief that everything could be reduced to immediate financial calculations without regard for long-term vision or historical significance. "You still don't understand what this is really about, do you?" Jake replied, handing the offer sheet back without even reading the terms. "This isn't just about money, though there's certainly plenty of that involved. This is about preserving automotive history, about maintaining the legacy of American engineering excellence, about ensuring that future generations can experience these vehicles the way Tommy intended them to be experienced. You see dollar signs where I see cultural artifacts that deserve better stewardship than whatever profit-maximizing strategy your financial advisors might recommend." Jake gestured toward the underground vault, where the LED lighting continued to showcase vehicles that represented the pinnacle of American automotive achievement. Every car down there tells a story about innovation, about craftsmanship, about the dreams and ambitions of engineers and designers who believed they could build something extraordinary. Tommy understood that, and he spent 40 years ensuring these stories would be preserved for people who could appreciate their true significance. I'm not going to let that vision be diminished by people who measure everything in terms of immediate financial calculations without regard for long-term vision or historical significance. The finality in Jake's voice made it clear that no amount of money would change his position, and Marcus's team began the awkward process of recognizing that their carefully planned acquisition had failed completely. The legal documents Tommy had prepared were too comprehensive to challenge. The authentication was too thorough to question, and Jake's newfound confidence was too genuine to undermine through intimidation or manipulation. As Marcus and his team prepared to leave the excavation site, their expensive vehicles looking increasingly out of place in the industrial landscape, Jake felt the weight of transformation settling around him like a comfortable jacket. The desperate, isolated mechanic who had
inherited a burned garage 3 months earlier no longer existed, replaced by someone with the resources, knowledge, and confidence necessary to honor Tommy's legacy while building his own future in the automotive world. Eddie clapped Jake on the shoulder with the rough affection of someone who had witnessed an extraordinary personal transformation. "So what's the plan now, boss? You've got the world's most valuable underground garage, a collection that's going to make automotive historians weep with joy, and enough documentation to keep lawyers busy for the next decade. Where do we go from here?" Jake looked out across the industrial district, seeing it now not as a graveyard of broken dreams, but as the foundation for something unprecedented in the automotive preservation world. Tommy's underground vault was just the beginning. With proper planning and sufficient resources, the entire property could be transformed into a world-class automotive museum and research facility that would attract enthusiasts and scholars from around the globe. "We're going to build something Tommy never imagined possible," Jake said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had finally found his true calling. "We're going to create a place where automotive history isn't just preserved, but celebrated, where people can experience these vehicles the way they were meant to be experienced, where the stories behind the metal and chrome can be shared with anyone who has the passion to understand them." The vision was ambitious beyond anything Jake would have dared to contemplate just hours earlier. But Tommy's legacy had provided not only the financial resources to make it possible, but also the network of relationships and professional credibility necessary to attract the support such a project would require. Automotive manufacturers, museum professionals, and collector car enthusiasts would all have compelling reasons to participate in an effort to preserve and showcase the vehicles that defined American automotive excellence.
As the sun finally broke through the winter clouds, casting long shadows across the excavation site and warming the frozen ground where Tommy's greatest secret had finally been revealed, Jake Rivera stood at the threshold of a future that honored both his uncle's vision and his own dreams. The burned garage that had seemed like the end of everything had become the beginning of something extraordinary, a testament to the power of patience, planning, and unshakable faith in the value of preserving the best of what humanity could create when dreams were backed by determination and skill. The mocking laughter that had echoed across this same ground just months earlier was now just a memory, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, if you're willing to dig deep enough, the treasures buried beneath disappointment and despair are worth more than anyone ever dared to imagine. 5 years after the discovery that changed everything, Jake Rivera stood in the gleaming main hall of the Tommy Rivera Automotive Heritage Center, watching as a group of automotive engineering students from MIT examined the pristine 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda convertible that had once been hidden beneath layers of concrete and decades of careful planning. The museum that had risen from the ashes of a burned garage now occupied a sprawling complex that encompassed not only the original property, but also 3 adjacent blocks, creating a world-renowned destination that attracted over 200,000 visitors annually from every corner of the globe. The transformation had been nothing short of miraculous. Though Jake had learned that miracles were usually the result of careful planning, enormous effort, and the kind of vision that refused to be diminished by short-term obstacles or narrow-minded critics. The underground vault that once was Tommy's secret sanctuary now served as the centerpiece of a climate-controlled exhibition space that showcased the evolution of American automotive excellence from the muscle car era through modern electric vehicle innovations. But beyond the obvious spectacle of rare and valuable automobiles, the Heritage Center had become something far more significant. A living laboratory where automotive history informed contemporary engineering challenges, and where the dreams of past generations inspired future innovations.
Jake's office occupied the top floor of the museum's administrative building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided panoramic views of the industrial district that had once seemed like a graveyard of abandoned dreams. The neighborhood had undergone its own transformation, with the Heritage Center serving as an anchor for economic development that had attracted automotive research facilities, specialty manufacturing companies, and educational institutions focused on advanced transportation technologies. What had once been a collection of forgotten warehouses and struggling repair shops was now a thriving hub of automotive innovation that generated thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in economic activity. The success had brought its own complications and responsibilities that Jake had never anticipated during those desperate months when foreclosure notices and Marcus Delano's mockery had seemed like insurmountable obstacles. Managing an institution of this magnitude required skills in finance, public relations, educational programming, and international diplomacy that Jake had developed through necessity rather than formal training. But Tommy's meticulous record-keeping and extensive network of professional relationships had provided a foundation that made the learning curve manageable, and Jake had discovered talents and interests he never knew he possessed. The Heritage Center's research division had become particularly significant in recent years, with automotive manufacturers and technology companies funding studies that used historical vehicles as inspiration for contemporary design challenges.
The center's engineers had developed innovations in aerodynamics, material science, and powertrain efficiency by analyzing and reverse engineering solutions that Detroit's engineers had pioneered decades earlier. Academic partnerships with universities around the world had established the Heritage Center as a legitimate research institution, whose contributions to automotive knowledge extended far beyond simple preservation and display. Jake's personal transformation had been equally profound, though more subtle than the obvious changes in his professional circumstances and financial situation. The confidence that had emerged during his confrontation with Marcus Delano had evolved into a quiet authority that came from understanding his place in a larger historical narrative and his responsibility as a steward of cultural artifacts that transcended individual ownership. He spoke regularly at automotive conferences and university symposiums, sharing insights about preservation techniques, historical research methods, and the intersection of technological innovation with cultural heritage that had become his area of acknowledged expertise. The Heritage Center's educational programs had perhaps exceeded even Tommy's most optimistic dreams for the impact his collection might eventually achieve. The museum's partnership with local school districts brought thousands of students annually to experience automotive history firsthand, inspiring many to pursue careers in engineering, design, or manufacturing that would have been unimaginable without exposure to the tangible evidence of human creativity and technical achievement that the collection represented. Scholarship programs, funded through the Heritage Center's endowment, were supporting the education of students whose backgrounds mirrored Jake's own challenging circumstances, providing opportunities that might otherwise have been denied due to economic limitations or social obstacles. The most satisfying aspect of the transformation was the recognition that had come from the automotive community that had once dismissed or marginalized Jake's aspirations. Premium Auto Works had struggled with financial difficulties as the automotive industry evolved toward electric vehicles and advanced manufacturing techniques that required expertise Marcus's organization had never developed. The last Jake had heard, Marcus was working as a regional sales representative for an automotive parts distributor, a position that provided steady income but little opportunity for the kind of influence and recognition he had once wielded through manipulation and intimidation. Eddie Castellanos had become the Heritage Center's Director of Facilities and Construction, overseeing ongoing expansion projects and maintaining the complex infrastructure required to support a world-class museum and research facility. His company, Castellanos Construction, had grown into a regional powerhouse specializing in historic preservation and custom museum installations, with projects extending across the United States and internationally.
The initial partnership had provided Eddie with financial security beyond anything he had imagined possible in the demolition business.
As the afternoon sun streamed through his office windows, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him from the ashes of professional humiliation to his current position as director of one of the world's most respected automotive institutions. The burned garage that had once seemed like the ultimate symbol of failed dreams had become the foundation for something that exceeded even Tommy's most optimistic visions for the impact his collection might eventually achieve. But perhaps more importantly, the experience had taught Jake about resilience, about the importance of believing in something larger than immediate circumstances, and about the power of properly supported dreams to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The phone on Jake's desk buzzed with a message from his assistant, reminding him that the evening's keynote speaker, automotive design legend Chip Foose, had arrived early and was requesting a private tour of the collection before the gala began.
Jake smiled as he prepared to leave his office, remembering the days when meeting such a celebrity would have seemed impossible, when his reputation in the automotive community had been so damaged that even minor figures in the industry avoided association with him. Now, automotive legends sought him out for his expertise and insights, recognizing the Heritage Center as an institution worthy of their time and attention. As Jake walked through the museum's exhibition halls toward the main entrance where Chip Foose was waiting, he passed displays that told the story not just of American automotive excellence, but also of the importance of preserving cultural heritage for future generations. School children who visited the Heritage Center would grow up understanding that the vehicles surrounding them represented more than transportation. They were expressions of human creativity, technological innovation, and the belief that tomorrow could be better than today if people were willing to work toward that vision. The Heritage Center had become Tommy Rivera's greatest masterpiece, but it was also Jake Rivera's vindication and the foundation for a future that honored the past while embracing the possibilities that lay ahead. The mocking laughter that once echoed across a burned parking lot had been replaced by the excited voices of visitors discovering automotive treasures they had never imagined existed, preserved and presented by people who understood that some dreams are too important to be limited by conventional thinking or short-term obstacles. In the end, the story of the Rivera Automotive Heritage Center was really the story of faith. Tommy's faith in Jake's potential, Jake's faith in Tommy's vision, and their shared faith in the power of automotive excellence to inspire, educate, and transform the lives of people who encounter it with open minds and appreciative hearts. The concrete vault that had once hidden treasures from the world had become a beacon that attracted visitors from around the globe, drawn by the promise that some things are worth preserving, some dreams are worth pursuing, and some legacies are worth a lifetime of dedication to protect and share. As Jake opened the museum's main doors to greet his distinguished guest, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across exhibition halls filled with automotive treasures that would inspire future generations of engineers, designers, and dreamers. The burned garage had become a palace, the mocked mechanic had become a respected authority, and the hidden collection had become a gift to the world that would continue giving long after everyone involved in its discovery had joined Tommy Rivera in whatever place exists for people who understand that the best treasures are the ones you share with others who can appreciate their true significance. What an incredible journey from burned-out garage to world-renowned museum. If this story of perseverance and hidden treasures inspired you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us bring you more amazing stories like this one. 5 years after the discovery that changed everything, Jake Rivera stood in the gleaming main hall of the Tommy Rivera Automotive Heritage Center, watching as a group of automotive engineering students from MIT examined the pristine 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda convertible that once was hidden beneath layers of concrete and decades of careful planning. The museum that had risen from the ashes of a burned garage now occupied a sprawling complex that encompassed not only the original property, but also 3 adjacent blocks, creating a world-renowned destination that attracted over 200,000 visitors annually from every corner of the globe.